The Italian players walked onto the pitch carrying bouquets of flowers. It was supposed to be a peace offering because they knew what was waiting for them. They'd spent the past week unable to enter bars in Santiago without risking a beating. One of their journalists had already fled the country, and an Argentine reporter, mistaken for an Italian, was hospitalized after being attacked by a mob. So before the match began, the Italians spread out across the Estadio Nacional and offered flowers to the Chilean women in the stands. It was an apology for what their newspapers wrote, that Santiago was a backwater dumping ground, that Chilean women were loose, and that allowing this earthquake-ravaged nation to host the World Cup was pure madness. But the flowers were thrown back in their faces. The 66,000 Chileans packed into the stadium wanted blood, and they were going to get it. By the time the final whistle blows, the match will have produced 2 expulsions, a broken nose, and multiple interventions by armed police. By the time the footage reaches Britain, BBC commentator David Coleman will introduce the highlights reel with words that would become legendary.
The game you're about to see is the most stupid, appalling, disgusting and disgraceful exhibition of football possibly in the history of the game.
But here's what might surprise you. Through all of this chaos, not a single player received a red card. Not because the referee was lenient, not because the fouls weren't serious enough, but because the red card, that universal symbol understood by billions of fans across every continent, simply didn't exist yet. Today, the red card is so fundamental to football that it's impossible to imagine the sport without it. It's shown in amateur league matches and Champions League finals, in World Cup knockouts and Olympic tournaments. Children playing in schoolyards hold up imaginary cards when their friends foul them. The gesture has become universal, instantly recognisable to billions of people who have never even read the laws of the game. But it hasn't actually been a part of the game since football's, or even FIFA's, inception. And the circumstances that led to its creation were stranger and more violent than you might expect. See, in the early 1960s, international football was not the slickly produced, corporately sanitised product we recognise today. There were no VAR reviews, no goal line technology, no squad of officials with earpieces coordinating every decision. There was just one man with a whistle and his 2 linesmen trying to control 22 athletes from different countries who often couldn't understand a word he was saying. When players needed to be disciplined, the process was almost comically inadequate. A referee who wanted to caution a player, what we would now call a yellow card, would stop play, isolate the player, and verbally explain that he was being warned. He might even write the player's name in a notebook, but that was it. No visual signal, no universal gesture, just words. And when a player needed to be sent off, the referee would point towards the dressing rooms and hope that the message got through. In domestic leagues where everyone shared a common language, this system was manageable. It was still plagued with tension, certainly. Players argued, crowds booed, confusion was inevitable, although it was still manageable. But the World Cup was different. And the deep-seated flaws in the existing system were about to be exposed in one brutal, catastrophic game in 1962. See, the 1962 tournament was being held in Chile, a nation still recovering from catastrophe. 2 years earlier, on May 22, 1960, the country had been struck by the Valdivia earthquake, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in human history, going beyond what can even be measured by the Richter scale and measuring 9.5 on the moment magnitude scale. Entire coastal towns were swept away by tsunamis. Thousands died. The nation was still rebuilding, and in the midst of all of that reconstruction, Chile had refused to give up its hosting rights for the World Cup. Ever since the country had secured the rights in 1956, beating out the more developed nation of Argentina, they had faced ridicule from other countries for daring to host with their limited infrastructure. However, the Chilean people rallied around the words of Carlos Dietborn, who at the time was the head of the South American Football Confederation. As Dietborn said, "Because we have nothing, we want to do everything." It was a rally cry, calling for massive development in the nation's infrastructure. And it worked. Chile began building. So after the Valdivia earthquake devastated the infrastructure that they had managed to build in preparation for the World Cup, and with Carlos Dietborn now the sitting president of the World Cup Organising Committee, those words of his morphed from a diplomatic underdog slogan into a national motto for reconstruction. Because we have nothing, we will do everything. It was meant to be a source of immense national pride, a signal to the world that Chile hadn't been defeated and was standing tall. So when Italian journalists arrived and immediately began insulting the host nation, the response from the Chilean people was visceral. The articles the Italians wrote were dripping with contempt. And while this kind of casual national insult might have passed unremarked in European press circles, it landed very differently in a country that had just survived an apocalypse. The Chilean people read the translations and they were furious. By the time Chile drew Italy in the group stage, the animosity had grown far beyond the football game. FIFA, perhaps sensing the potential for disaster, brought Ken Aston into the assignment. The Italian Football Federation had objected to the original Spanish referee, fearing bias towards their South American opponents. Aston, an Englishman, was supposed to be neutral. More than that, he was supposed to bring a British stiff upper lip authority to proceedings that everyone suspected were about to get ugly. On paper, Aston seemed like the perfect choice. He was a schoolteacher by profession, accustomed to maintaining order among the unruly. In addition to that, he was a former lieutenant colonel in the British Army, having served in the Royal Artillery before transferring to the British Indian Army. After the war, he had sat on the Changi War Crimes Tribunal, weighing evidence and administering justice in contexts far graver than sport. This was a man who would judge the fate of war criminals. Surely he could handle a football match. However, the British newspaper, the Daily Express, wasn't so sure. Before the match, they warned, the tournament shows every sign of developing into a violent bloodbath. And they were right. The first foul came 12 seconds after kickoff. 12 seconds. The ball had barely travelled 10 metres. The Chilean players were already at war and the hostile crowd began to turn feral. 8 minutes into the game, Italy's Giorgio Farini kicked out at a Chilean player in retaliation. And Ken Aston had seen enough. He pointed toward the sideline. Farini was being sent off. Except, Farini didn't understand. Or he pretended not to understand. Or maybe he just simply didn't care. He stood on the pitch and refused to leave. Aston pointed again. Farini screamed back in Italian. Players from both teams surrounded them, a scrum of flailing arms and angry voices. The referee blew his whistle. Nobody moved. The crowd was on its feet now, the noise swelling and feeling like it was building to something volcanic. Nearly 10 minutes passed. 10 minutes of a World Cup match consumed by a single sending off that couldn't be completed because the player being sent off was refusing to go anywhere. The stalemate was only broken when Chilean police officers walked onto the field. With their hands resting on their holsters, they flanked Farini on either side and they dragged him off to the dressing room. An Italian national team player being led away like a common criminal in front of 66,000 screaming fans. A scene which would eventually air all around the world. It was a humiliating spectacle for the sport, and the match had only just begun. With Farini gone, the violence didn't subside. In fact, as you might expect, it escalated. Chilean players, emboldened by the home crowd and the perceived injustice of the Italian press, launched assault after assault. The most notorious incident involved Lionel Sanchez, the Chilean left winger. Sanchez was the son of a professional boxer, and he had apparently inherited his father's left hook. In a tussle on the sideline with tempers flaring and the ball nowhere near, Sanchez wound up and delivered a textbook punch directly to the face of the Italian captain, Umberto Muschio. Muschio's nose shattered, but Ken Aston didn't see it happen. He was on the other side of the pitch, dealing with the aftermath of another skirmish. The linesman, standing just meters from Sanchez, surely saw the punch land, but when Aston turned around, the linesman said nothing. Sanchez remained on the pitch, unpunished. Muschio played on with a broken nose and blood streaming down his face. The injustice festered. Later in the half, Italian defender Mario David continued amping things up. After being fouled by Sanchez and potentially seeking retribution for his captain, David launched himself at Sanchez with a flying kick aimed at his head. This time, Aston saw everything. David was sent off. And once again, the dismissal became an extended performance of shouting, gesturing, and confusion. The message struggling to break through the language barrier and the increasing wall of noise descending from the stands. Chile won that game 2-0. However, the scoreline was almost irrelevant. The match had seen 2 expulsions, multiple interventions by armed police, a broken nose, uncountable fouls, and several acts of violence that went entirely unpunished because the officials either didn't see them or wouldn't report them. Ken Aston walked off the pitch feeling utterly destroyed. In the dressing room afterward, he sat with his head in his hands. The Italian delegation was furious, accusing him of bias for failing to control the match and allowing their players to be assaulted. The Chileans were celebrating, but even their joy felt tainted by the ugliness that had preceded it. Ken Aston was a man who faced down war criminals in Singapore. He'd commanded soldiers under fire. He'd spent his professional life managing unruly children in English classrooms, but none of that had prepared him for this. 66,000 screaming fans, players who refused to accept his authority, a language barrier that made every decision a negotiation, and a system so fundamentally inadequate that sending someone off required armed intervention. The problem wasn't that Aston was a weak referee. The problem was that even a strong referee, even a man with Aston's credentials, his experience, his force of personality, was rendered completely powerless by a system that relied entirely on verbal communication in a sport that had outgrown culture. Ken Aston had considered abandoning the match entirely, but he ultimately decided not to, in an effort to at least try to keep the Italian players safe with whatever little authority he could exert. In the weeks that followed, Aston replayed the match in his mind obsessively. He thought about Farini standing in the centre circle, refusing to leave. He thought about the linesman who had likely seen Sanchez's punch, but refused to report it. He thought about how completely isolated he had felt. A single man with a whistle trying to impose order on chaos. The beautiful game had become something very ugly, and Ken Aston had been powerless to stop it. Ken Aston had always been an innovator, someone who saw problems and immediately began thinking about solutions. All the way back in 1946, he became the first referee to wear the black shirt with white trim that evolved into the modern referee kit. Prior to this, referees often wore dark blazers, which were restrictive, heavy when wet, and visually indistinct from crowd members or team officials. Aston had repurposed a military-issue black jacket, sewing on white trim himself to create a distinct, authoritative silhouette. After Aston introduced it, this lighter, more functional design became the global standard for referees for the next 50 years. And a year after that, in 1947, he tackled another visibility problem. See, linesmen at the time used flags provided by the home team, often in the club's colours. On a foggy London day, officiating a match between a team in beige and a team in brown, Aston had struggled to see the flag signals from across the pitch. And so, on his way home, he stopped at a war surplus store and he purchased a pair of yellow and red rain slickers. He cut these up and fashioned a set of high visibility flags. But despite the fixes he'd been able to enact, Aston still knew that there was more that he could give to the sport to make it run even smoother. However, as the 1966 World Cup came to England, Ken Aston was no longer on the pitch. He had been promoted. He was now a member of the FIFA Referees Committee, and he was appointed the head of World Cup referees for the 1966 tournament. It was a position of authority, certainly, but it also meant being forced to watch from the stands as the problems he had experienced firsthand in Santiago played out again and again. And as he sat there in the Wembley Stadium stands, he was about to get yet another wake-up call that his beloved game was in dire straits. On July 23rd, England played Argentina in the World Cup quarter-final. In England, the match would be remembered for Geoff Hurst's winning goal and the tactical rigour of Alf Ramsey's side. But in Argentina, it would be remembered very differently. They still call it El Robo del Siglo, the theft of the century. The referee was Rudolf Kreitlin, a German tailor. The Argentine captain was Antonio Retin, a massive midfielder with a boxer's build and the temperament to match. From the opening whistle, Retin made his presence felt to Kreitlin. He complained to the referee about decisions. He yelled and he pestered Kreitlin with a barrage of language the referee had no hope of understanding. Kreitlin spoke no Spanish. Retin spoke no German. And so, as had now become expected in World Cup matches, any interaction between them was a confusing pantomime of frustration. 35 minutes into the match, after another barrage of language and gestures he didn't understand, Kreitlin had had enough. He stopped play, he pointed at Retin, and then he pointed toward the sideline. The reason Kreitlin gave in his official match report would enter football folklore: violence of the tongue. It was a bit of an absurd charge. Kreitlin couldn't understand Retin's tongue. He had no idea what the Argentine captain was actually saying. He later clarified that the dismissal was for the manner of Retin's dissent. He looked at me with bad intentions, and that's when I realized he had insulted me, he said. But in the moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that a World Cup quarter-final had ground to a halt once again, because a referee and a player couldn't communicate. Retin refused to leave. He claimed he was simply asking for an interpreter and not insulting the referee. From the stands, Ken Aston could see everything falling apart. The players were surrounding the referee. The Argentine officials and coaching staff had stormed onto the pitch to protest. The English fans, 90,000 strong, were on their feet, booing, and also trying to decipher what was actually happening on the pitch. Aston was responsible for Kreitlin. He was responsible for the tournament's officiating standards, and he was watching the entire system collapse in real time once again. And so Ken Aston left his seat, walked down from the stands, and stepped onto the pitch. In full view of 90,000 spectators, Aston walked into the middle of a World Cup match to try to mediate a situation that the actual referee couldn't solve. Retin finally got the message. But the captain wasn't finished airing his frustrations. In a final act of defiance, he walked over to the corner of the pitch where a corner flag, a Union Jack, fluttered. He reached out, grabbed the fabric, and twisted it in his fist, a gesture that the English interpreted as him wiping his hands on their national flag. Then he walked toward the sideline and sat down on the red carpet reserved for the Royals. England ended up winning the match 1-0. The tournament would continue. England would go on to win the World Cup. But again, Ken Aston couldn't shake what he had witnessed, and what happened the following morning after the chaotic match would cause him to rethink everything about the game he loved. The next day, Jack Charlton, England's defender, was reading the Sunday newspapers when he came across a confusing piece of information. According to the press, both he and his brother Bobby had been cautioned during the Argentina match. It was a black mark on he and his brother's otherwise clean records, and Jack had no idea. During the match, Kreitlin had apparently written both the Charltons' names in his notebook, but that was it. No verbal warning, no gesture, no indication whatsoever they had been disciplined. The players had continued playing, unaware that they were now walking a tightrope, risking potential suspension as they headed into the semi-final. Confused and anxious, Jack Charlton called the World Cup press office. He was transferred around until eventually he got through to Ken Aston.
Ken,
Charlton asked.
is it true? Was I booked?
Aston didn't even know himself. The head of the World Cup referees, the man responsible for every official at the tournament, had to check the records before he could confirm whether one of England's star players had been cautioned, and that's when the realization finally settled in. If the players didn't know they were being punished, if the spectators didn't know what was happening, if the officials in the stands couldn't even tell who had been booked, then the entire disciplinary system was broken. Fundamentally broken. The violence of the tongue farce with Retin, the invisible bookings of the Charltons, the police interventions, the 10-minute standoffs, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. Verbal communication could not work in a global game. Ken Aston left the office that Sunday evening with a single question burning in his mind. If words weren't enough, what would be? The FIFA offices during the 1966 World Cup were located at Lancaster Gate, a beautiful Victorian building in central London. On the evening of July 24, 1966, the day after the routine incident and the day of Jack Charlton's bewildered phone call, Aston climbed into his car and began his normal drive home. His mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying the images from the game. Crichton pointing helplessly at the sideline, Routine refusing to move, the 10 minutes of chaos that had followed, the Charltons discovering their cautions in the morning paper. 4 years earlier, Ken Aston had been the one standing on the pitch officiating in Santiago, watching armed police drag Giorgio Farini away, and in all that time, nothing had changed. If anything, things had gotten worse. The journey took Aston through Kensington High Street, a busy thoroughfare, particularly in the evening hours. Traffic was heavy. He found himself stopping at a set of lights near the junction with Church Street, one of the most congested intersections in the area. He sat there, watching the lights change, cycling through multiple times as the traffic gradually filtered through. Green, yellow, red. He watched the sequence repeat and he thought to himself, yellow, caution, slow down, be careful. Red, stop, you're done. And somewhere in that mundane moment, stuck in traffic on a London street, the summer evening light fading over the city, Ken Aston had the idea that would change football forever. In all of his years with FIFA, Aston had travelled the world. He'd been to South America, to Africa, to Asia, to every corner of Europe, and everywhere he went, traffic lights worked the same way. Red meant stop. Yellow meant caution, slow down. It didn't matter if you were in Berlin or Buenos Aires, Tokyo or Toronto. The colours transcended language. What if referees could communicate the same way? The idea was so simple that Aston almost couldn't believe nobody had thought of it before. Yellow for a caution. Slow down, you're being warned. Red for dismissal. Stop, you're done, your match is over. No words needed. No translation required. He thought about all the situations where this would have helped. With a visual signal, a clear, unmistakable colour, every one of those situations would have been different. The player would know. The crowd would know. The officials would all know. There would be no ambiguity, no language barrier, no room for confusion or denial. By the time he got home to Ilford, Aston was bursting with excitement. He found his wife, Hilda, and he began explaining the idea. Hilda listened. She agreed it was brilliant, but she also spotted a practical problem. How would it actually work? Maybe armbands, like the captain's armband, but in two colours. A red band on one arm, yellow on the other. Then the referee could point to the appropriate one when issuing a decision. No. Hilda had a better idea. She disappeared into another room and she returned with sheets of coloured craft paper. She took a pair of scissors and she carefully cut two rectangles, one yellow, one red, sized to fit neatly into a shirt pocket. It was perfect. A referee could carry both cards in his pocket. When a player needed to be cautioned, he would just hold up the yellow card. When a player needed to be sent off, he would just hold up the red. One simple gesture, visible from the back row of any stadium, immediately understood by anyone watching regardless of what language they spoke. Aston took the prototype cards to the other FIFA officials, and they loved the idea. And the greatest thing about it was it wasn't some theoretical proposal that would require years of debate and committee review. It was a simple, elegant solution to a problem that had plagued international football for decades. The materials cost almost nothing. The implementation was trivially easy, and the benefits were obvious to anyone who had witnessed the chaos of the previous years. FIFA decided to test the system at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. It was an ideal proving ground. With athletes from every continent, the Olympics too had always struggled with the same language barriers that plagued the World Cup. If the cards could work at the Olympics, they could work anywhere. And so, as the games kicked off, the cards started coming out. Sometimes. Old habits were hard to shake, and while plenty of players did receive cautions and some were sent off, the cards didn't always make an appearance. But when they did, they seemed to clarify any lingering confusion. It seemed like the experiment was a success. And so, by 1970, red and yellow cards were written into the official laws of the game. The World Cup that year was also held in Mexico, and for the first time in history, referees walked onto the pitch with Aston's Invention tucked into their pockets. But the very existence and announcement of the cards seemed to cause something strange to happen. Throughout the entire 1970 tournament, the yellows were used, Kahi Asatiani of the USSR having the not-so-prestigious honour of receiving the first one in World Cup history, but not a single red card was shown. It wasn't that the matches were all nice and tame. Fouls were committed, players lost their tempers. There were moments that, under normal circumstances, might have warranted a sending off. But the referees hesitated. The red card felt like a nuclear option. It felt like a dramatic, visible act that would focus the attention of an entire stadium on a single moment. Some officials were worried about the power that it yielded. They were worried about inciting crowds. But despite the hesitation, the matches certainly weren't as tense and violent as they had been in previous years. So there was also another theory, that the mere existence of the cards was changing behaviour. Players knew that if they crossed the line, there would be no ambiguity and no language barrier to hide behind. The referee would simply reach into his pocket and hold up that bright red rectangle. And everyone, the players, the fans, and the officials, would know exactly what it meant. The threat of the card was itself a deterrent. And so, with the 1970 World Cup running smoothly, the world would have to wait another 4 more years to see a red card actually produced at a World Cup. The 1974 tournament was held in West Germany. In the group stage, the hosts played Chile. The same Chile that had been at the centre of the Battle of Santiago 12 years earlier, the match that had first shown Ken Aston how desperately the game needed reform. And Ken Aston, who had now officially been sworn in as the chairman of the FIFA Referees Committee, was there, in the stands, watching. In the 67th minute of the West Germany vs Chile match, Chilean striker Carlos Casali kicked out at a German player in retaliation. The referee, Doğan Babacan of Turkey, blew his whistle and play stopped. Babacan reached into his pocket. In the stands, Ken Aston leaned forward. And then, the referee pulled out the small red rectangle and held it high above his head. The stadium fell into a moment of recognition. Everyone knew what it meant. There was no confusion, no argument, no 10-minute standoff, no police intervention, just instant, universal understanding. Casali walked toward the sideline, and he left the pitch. It seemed obvious that Ken Aston's invention had been officially a success. However, not everyone embraced the change immediately. Despite being invented by an Englishman, the English Football Association was still skeptical. They introduced the cards briefly in 1976, but then they scrapped them in 1981, believing they made referees too demonstrative and theatrical. There were also concerns that the dramatic gesture of producing a card might inflame an already hostile crowd. English football was suffering through a dark era of hooliganism at the time, and some administrators worried that flashy displays of authority might make things worse rather than better. It took until 1987 for the cards to be permanently reintroduced in English domestic football. By then, the rest of the world had long since recognised them as essential. The irony had to have annoyed Ken. The most important innovation in football officiating history, invented by an Englishman in the streets of London, took more than 2 decades to be fully accepted in the country of its birth. Ken Aston died in 2001 at the age of 86. He never directly profited financially from his invention. There are no royalties or licensing fees on red cards. The idea was so simple, so obvious in retrospect, that it almost seems as though it must have always existed. The red card has been shown tens of thousands of times since that World Cup game in West Germany. It's been the subject of endless arguments about whether a decision was right or wrong. But one thing nobody argues about is what it means.